Alright, I wanted to make a little video here. I think I might try a new thing on my videos. I think I've wanted to try it before and never have. But, I would like to keep this one to under to 20 minutes or so. I know, like when I rewatch my videos, man, they're so terrible. But, one of the main problems is because I just go everywhere instead of being somewhat concise. So, 10 minutes is what most YouTubers do, but I don't think I can do that. So let's try 20. I doubt this. I think I've had this idea before and it never lasts, so we'll see. But I wanted to talk about the Xbox Series X, and I also wrote out a little bit of, not a script, but like 3 topics I wanted to hit. I literally wrote down 3 topics, so it's better than nothing. So the Series X is more powerful than the PS5, as we know. And the PS5 SSD isn't going to save it, we know that. The Series X is just more powerful. And I believe power is the deciding factor in every console race. Now people will argue this back and forth. This isn't the video for it. But like, just ask yourself, why were PlayStation fanboys so concerned? Why are they so obsessed with PlayStation 5 being more powerful than Series X? And if you don't believe that, just go back to where all the people were wondering about the specs of the next-gen consoles. PlayStation fanboys were obsessed. Insanely obsessed with wanting to be more powerful than the Xbox Series X. I mean, they were obsessed with it. So, at the one hand, PlayStation fanboys, and people will tell me now, oh, power doesn't matter. The most powerful system never sells the most, and all this baloney. But yet so if that's true, why were they so worried about PS5 being more powerful before the specs were announced? Because now the specs are announced, it is what it is. They have to deal with whatever they have. So now they're trying all these other tactics, like, we got all the exclusive games, this and that, because they can't fight about power. Believe me, if they had the power, they'd be sitting there, Xbox is weaker, but they know they're weaker, so they have to resort to everything else now. And Sony can't change the PS5 now. It's locked in stone. So, they know they just have to fight with what they have, so they fight with what they have. Oh, it's about the exclusives. No, it's not. But anyways, like 90% of people play Call of Duty, not exclusives. But that's, I'm going to continue to get off topic there. So the Series X has more power than the PS5. But here are 3 key ways that I feel like Microsoft is screwing this advantage up, or could screw it up. It's not a done deal, but it could screw it up. And I think it's pretty hard to screw up. That's the good news from Microsoft. Like, no matter all these factors, I think it'll still shine through. But they're trying in a lot of ways to screw it up. Alright, first way that I have written down here, because once again, I have like 3 lines worth of notes. And that is Microsoft's insistence on 60 frames per second first party games. Why are they doing this? If you've noticed, over time, Microsoft has really begun to make almost all their franchises 60 frames per second as a standard. Like Halo, every Halo game that comes out now is 60 FPS, even in campaign mode. Or they used to all be 30 FPS. That's Microsoft's tentpole series, And Forza, of course, prides itself on being a locked 60. Gears, the latest Gears was also 60. So, the Gears 5. So, pretty much every major first party franchise Microsoft has now is 60 FPS. And it's annoying. Why are they doing this? Like, stop. People talk on the internet about how great 60 FPS is. But if it is, then why aren't they complaining about Sony, and why isn't everybody moving over to Xbox? Why are there no... All you hear about is how great Sony first-party exclusives are. So, you have this divide, this hypocrisy in the gaming culture, I'll call it, media, community, all of it. On the one hand, 60 FPS is often like touted, and 60 FPS is so. On the other hand, these Sony exclusives are also constantly touted, hyped, called the best games ever. They're the most hyped games. The Last of Us 2, it was 30 FPS. And it got like a 96 Metacritic, I believe. I mean, it was hyped to high heaven and back. It was billions and trillions of posts are written about every Sony exclusive on forums and message boards because all their fanboys are so obsessed with Xbox. And, this game was so hyped, it's 30 FPS. So how can the gaming community sit here on one side and always have this snide, oh, only 60 FPS is good attitude, and then turn around and like the most highly rated games, not the best selling games, mind you, but the most highly rated games are Sony exclusives. We hear all the time, all Sony's exclusives are pretty much 30 FPS, and all their developers say why it's necessary. I can't think of a major Sony franchise that's 60 FPS. Like The Last of Us is 30. Uncharted, 30. Even their racing game, Drive Club, is 30. Now, racing games are like one genre where 60 is just like an accepted standard. But even Sony's racing game is only 30, Drive Club was. God of War, as I call it, was 30. All these games are 30 FPS. I think Uncharted had multiplayer that kind of was sort of between 40 and 60, It also looked pretty trashy, coincidentally. See, that's the thing. I don't mind if, for multiplayer, I guess 60 is better. So I wouldn't mind that much if Halo did 60 FPS multiplayer, but they need to do a 30 FPS campaign so I can really pump those graphics. So every major Sony first-party exclusive franchise is 30 FPS. Spider-Man is 30 FPS, right? They're all 30 FPS across the board. The only Sony franchise I can think of that's kind of 60 FPS is Gran Turismo, which is the racing game, so it kind of has to be 60 FPS, And it's not even, I was mentioning the point about that. If you look at Gran Turismo and you look at the Digital Foundry videos about it and stuff, it's not really 60, it's 55. Sometimes it's 60, sometimes it's 57, It's 50 to 60. The thing people don't realize is that makes it much less demanding like Forza, because Forza's always locked 60. What locked 60 means is that the lowest frame rate has to be 60. That's the lowest possible. So that means a lot of time the game is going to be running 63, 65, 68, 70, It has to run really high to be a locked 60 where it never drops a frame below 60. So and compare that to Gran Turismo, which is not a locked 60. It's a 50 to 60. It's much more demanding on Forza. Forza's hitting a much higher bar. Even though they're both ostensibly 60 FPS games. There's only one Microsoft franchise that I can think of that's 30 FPS anymore, which is Forza Horizon. And it's coincidentally, it's Microsoft's one of their most popular right now franchises. 60 FPS is really important, isn't it? The one Microsoft franchise that's not 60 FPS seems to be doing the best. So yeah, and now Microsoft's getting even more ridiculous and talking about 120 FPS games, which is beyond the pale of stupidity. I think Halo is going to be 120 on the Series X multiplayer or something like that. I mean, it's insane. 60 FPS is bad enough. A Sony developer actually on Twitter recently came out. He's an Insomniac dev, I think. Or no, he's a Naughty Dog dev. And he broke it down how 60 FPS games actually have, or 30 FPS games actually have 4 times more power to make them pretty. Because he broke it down a 30 FPS frame is 33 milliseconds of rendering time. A 60 FPS frame is 16 milliseconds. So he said the geometry and all that for games is about the same either way. So he said that's going to be in setup and everything. So that's going to be 10 milliseconds for both the 60 FPS game and the 30 FPS game. So in the end, he said you have about 6 milliseconds left on the 60 FPS game for like all your effects, everything to make it look all pretty. And then you have about 23 milliseconds left on the 30 FPS game, because both of them have 10 milliseconds come off. So you end up with 23 milliseconds of time to render nice graphics on the 30 FPS game versus 6 milliseconds on the 60 FPS game. Almost 4 times difference. Alright, this is Sony first party devs talking, you know. They know where their bread is buttered. So, and here's another easy way to put it. Even if you don't believe the 4 times thing, even though it's coming straight from a dev, just double it. I mean, that's simple enough. If you run a game at 60 FPS, it just simply requires twice the resources as to run it at 30. So, if the Xbox Series X is 12 teraflops and it's running a 60 FPS game, that's effectively like 6 teraflops running a 30 FPS game. So if the PS5 is sitting here running its 30 teraflops games, 30 FPS games, then its 10 teraflops are going to beat the Series X's 12 teraflops because it's using all 10, while the Series X is effectively using 6. You know? It's just common sense. Like, stop doing this, Microsoft. Stop doing this. They're so dumb sometimes. Like, they're smart in that they came out and they made the Series X more powerful. That's awesome. That's great. But then they kneecap it like this. They don't seem to understand. And they don't understand why, like, Halo Infinite got bashed so much. And they delayed it even. They delayed it. I think it looked pretty good. But they delayed it and they're like, I wonder why people... Maybe because it was coming out on the Xbox One and it's 60 FPS. You know, I wonder why people thought the graphics weren't good. I think most of it was fanboyism. I think the graphics were fine. I think 90% of it was Sony fanboys concerned trolling. I think the graphics looks pretty good. But it doesn't change the fact that it's a 60 FPS game that runs on that 1.3 teraflop base hardware. Of course it's not going to look that great, you know? Whereas, like, this Ratchet game, which I don't got on the screen, which I don't even think looks that good, but it looks decent. It's a 30 FPS game running only on PS5. Like, no wonder it's looking a little better, and it's really not even looking that good. But, alright. Second part that where Microsoft is ruining their power advantage is with current gen support. Now, this has been talked about a lot in the media, so we all know about it. And that just is that Microsoft, basically, their first party titles, at least the first couple of years they've said, are going to support the Xbox One. So that means you have to support the base hardware of 1.2 teraflops of the Xbox, 1.3 actually, of the Xbox One. So that just holds the games back. You'll have a lot of people argue, oh, it doesn't hold them back. That's what they're arguing about the Series S, the so-called Lockhart. But then somehow when it comes to the Xbox One, they'll kind of admit, oh yeah, it does hold games back. Yeah, having to make games on weaker platforms holds them back. Now you can mitigate a lot of it by running it in lower res. You know, so you're running the same game at 1080p. You have to run it with 4 times more pixels at 4K. But see, a lot of games aren't even 4K. They're just checkerboard at 4K, and they look 99% as sharp, but there's like way less rendering stress. So when you start like not really running 4K games at 4K, then you have to start running, in order to keep the power ratios the same, you have to start running, you know, 1080p games like 900p and so forth and so on. So, but anyways, yeah, that's the second big thing Microsoft is doing that's probably stupid, is requiring Xbox One support on their early exclusives. Now, I think that one's a little arguable, and like I said, I think a lot of it can be blunted by the fact that, okay, yes, it sucks that they support the Xbox One, but it's at lower res and so forth. But you know what? That didn't work for the Xbox One X, because I don't care what anybody says, the Xbox One X was not taken advantage of. The Xbox One X was 6 teraflops. There's nothing on the Xbox One X, period, that makes you think it's 5 times more powerful than the Xbox One, which it is, you know? So the Xbox One was holding it back. So that's the second thing Microsoft is doing that's stupid, is requiring Xbox One ports. Now requiring its next gen games to support Xbox One. Now that will take care of itself in time, in 1 to 2 years. So that's kind of, it's not great, but it's self-limiting. Like it's going to be automatically, like within a year or two, once they start selling a lot of regular Series X's and stuff, they won't have to support the Xbox One anymore. So that's not going to be forever. So that's a good part about it, but it's still a negative. So that's two things so far. Their insistence on 60 FPS exclusives, when Sony gets away with murder doing all these 30 FPS exclusives like Ratchet and Clank. And then second thing is insisting on support for last gen, the Xbox One. You know, and I mean, before this is over, they're going to have to support at least 4 consoles: the Xbox One, the Xbox One X, the Xbox Series S, and the Xbox Series X. Now, third thing, and this might be the biggest one, and maybe I should make another video about this. I probably will, because I think this is huge. Xbox Series S could be a massive disaster, in my opinion. Because why? I think that the most powerful console will usually, you know, all things equal, tends to win. You look at it, why the Xbox 360 beat the PS3. Because it was more powerful. They were very close, and the 360 outsold the PS3 worldwide. Now, the Xbox didn't beat the PS2. People will point at that to be like, oh, PS2 wasn't as powerful as Xbox. Well, Sony fanboys are nuts. They probably think PS2 was as powerful as Xbox, even though it was like 1/2 the power. I mean, it literally had 32 megabytes of RAM, whereas the Xbox had 64 megabytes. The Xbox had literally double the RAM and a much more powerful GPU and CPU. I mean, it just trounced the PS2. But you can see it in all the versions. Like, I remember IGN used to do this thing head-to-head, and every time the Xbox won. Surprise, because the Xbox was more powerful. But by a long shot. But like, oh, PS2 was less powerful than Xbox. Yeah, Xbox came out a year later. Like, nobody knew who Microsoft was. They were just getting established, you know. And I think it did really good for what it was. I mean, imagine Halo. Halo was made by that powerful hardware, you know. It wouldn't have existed without it. And it really put Microsoft on the map. But all that said, oh yeah, I think, well, what I decided is that the most powerful console, I say, wins. It's the most powerful base console. Absent some other factor, like a gimmick like the Wii that causes that console to win, or even the Switch. I'm saying just between Xbox and PlayStation, let's put it that way. Because Nintendo has a different, like, family-friendly audience completely. But, well, I would call them core gamers as well, because, you know. So, yeah, so, the reason I think that the One X didn't cause the Xbox to win the sales war, well, one, it was $4.99. Two, it just, all it did was like somewhat prettier versions of Xbox One games. You know, they didn't really allow it to stretch its legs. So, of course, you know, it kind of is a hard sell when you're asking people to pay $500 for it, and you're just giving them like 10% prettier games in a lot of cases. You know, you're just giving them an up-res and maybe a couple more coats of shine, you know, nothing drastic. But what I realized was that the reason Xbox One X didn't really affect the sales trajectory is because they still had to support the Xbox One, whereas the PS4 only had to support the PS4, which was more powerful than the Xbox One. You know what I'm saying? So it's the base console that kind of decides it, I realized. See where I'm going with this? Who's going to have the weaker base console next gen? Well, it's going to be the Xbox, because it's going to have the Series S that's only 4 teraflops. Whereas the PS5 is 9 teraflops. So I really feel that Microsoft could have it. This could be big. The other two things, the 60 FPS and the current gen support, I think they're just temporary. They're minor things. Like, all the third-party games are still going to run at 30 FPS and they're going to look better on the Series X and all that. So those are things, but I don't think they're huge. But the huge thing, in my opinion, is that the Series S could really muddy things when people are going to be confused. Like, who's more powerful? I'll just get a PS5. I know it's powerful. You know, I know it's good. I'll just get it. That's what I worry is going to happen. Sony's going to have one baseline, and Microsoft's going to be sitting here supporting a weak baseline. It's going to hold it back. I don't care what anybody says. You know, so that's what I worry about. Now, I think that the Series S is not going to sell well at all. But because I think that they can't make it cheaper enough. It only has like it's only saving a little money on the SoC, you know. It's not saving money much on RAM. It's not saving, you know what I mean? So anyways, so that's the three things I think Microsoft put themselves in great position this gen in the hardware race. But they've done those big three things that I think could nullify the power advantage, which would be really stupid on their part if they do it. And I'm starting to get annoyed at Phil Spencer, to be honest. But anyway, so that's what I've got, and that's my screed for today.